and political settlement is said by many to have had an idealistic thread originally that was later subverted. Do you agree with this?
There was an idealistic thread in the 40s. It shows up most strikingly in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was actually initiated by the United States. Eleanor Roosevelt was the leading figure pushing it, but it had very broad participation, direct participation in many parts of the world. So it was a joint declaration of pretty much the whole world as could be brought together. And it's a pretty forthcoming document, especially if you look at the socioeconomic rights, Article 25. It calls for things that we ought to take for granted, but that don't exist. Every person should have the right to a decent job, to health care, to whatever makes life feasible. There's special provision for women, for mothers after birth they must be cared for. Their children must be cared for. Well, that was an idea. That was still the effect of the New Deal spirit, which had some effects, but overall, there was almost nothing idealistic. Starting toward the end of the war, in the late 44 or 45, there was a wave of radical democracy that was spreading over the world. The Depression was over. Maybe the war was coming to an end. Russia was defeating the Nazis. Japanese imperialism had been turned back. There was a lot of hope that maybe we can move to a new world, which will be really just and honorable. The U.S. wasn't having that. When the U.S. troops first entered Italy, that's where they entered the continent first in 1944, U.S. and British troops. Italy had been pretty much liberated by the resistance, the partisans. They had begun to establish a worker-based, worker-owned economy, especially in northern Italy. The U.S. and Britain dismantled it, restored the old regime, including the king who had supported the Nazis. Victor Emmanuel imposed what's his name? It escapes me. The Badoglio, the field marshal, who had been responsible for the Ethiopia invasion. He was put in. Fascist collaborators restored. The old order was restored. Same in Greece. There was an uprising in Greece. British weren't strong enough to control it. Americans moved in. Maybe 150,000 people or so were killed. Finally, Stalin wasn't supporting the guerrillas. He was living up to the Yalta Agreement, which put this in the British-American zone. And they were decimated, and Greece was restored to a quasi-fascist order. That's pretty much the same happened in Western Europe. The old order was reconstituted. Plenty of Nazi collaborators. Some interesting. Same thing was happening in Japan. That's in 1945, February 1945, the U.S. was basically taking over world governance from Britain. Britain had been the former global hegemon, and the U.S. was pushing them aside and taking over. First place to be concerned with was Latin America. That's our territory. So in February 45, the United States called a hemispheric conference in Latin America, where it imposed an economic charter for the Americas, which was opposed to economic nationalism in all its forms, there's a background. The State Department was deeply concerned with what they called I'm virtually quoting now, the philosophy of the new nationalism, which calls for an equitable distribution of resources for the population and insists that the first beneficiaries of a country's resources should be the people of that country. None of that. The first beneficiaries are foreign investors. That was the economic charter for the Americas. So Brazil was allowed to produce steel, but low-level steel that didn't compete with high-quality U.S. steel, and so on. That's 45. The Bretton Woods institutions in 44, right before that, were kind of a mixture. They did establish a system in which the U.S. would be able to basically have free economic penetration and essentially substantial political control over most of the world. But on the other hand, they did establish an economic order, which did lay the basis for 25 years of quite substantial growth. In France, it's called the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. In the United States, economists call it the golden age of the American economy, fastest growth rate, egalitarian growth rate. New Deal provisions were still in force. There was a business offensive already building up to try to break it down, but the business offensive didn't really succeed until the late 70s and the onset of the neoliberal period, which just totally reversed it all, was basically bitter class war, go into the details, but by international standards, which are not very elevated, the Bretton Woods system was moderately decent. But the things like, I just talk about the UD, Universal Declaration again, through the subsequent period, it was at least honored in words. By the time you get to the neoliberal years, they don't even pretend. So Jeane Kirkpatrick, Reagan's UN ambassador, dismissed the Universal Declaration as what she called a letter to Santa Claus. She was talking about the socioeconomic provisions. And it's just a letter to Santa Claus. Nobody can pay attention to this nonsense. The human rights director for the Reagan and Bush administration, Paula Dobriansky, said, these things are a myth. We have to destroy the myth that people have socioeconomic rights. None of this Universal Declaration business. Morris Abram, who was the delegate to the UN Commission on Human Rights, vetoed. He was the sole veto of the UN resolution on right to development, basically Article 25. He said, this is pernicious, destructive, it's a dangerous perversion. We have to stop all of this. So by the time you get to neoliberalism, which was basically class war, even in a verbal pretense of honoring these provisions was gone. And that's part of the history of the post-war period. During the early